Behind the grand columns and ornate balconies of one of the South's most elegant mansions, a darkness festered that no amount of whitewash could conceal. This is the story of a plantation house where unspeakable horrors occurred daily, where the screams were muffled by thick walls and where morning brought no relief from the nightmare. What happened within these walls would shock even the most hardened historians, and the truth that emerged decades later would force an entire community to confront the monster they had once celebrated as a pillar of society. The question we must ask ourselves is, how many other stories like this remain buried beneath the floorboards of history? In the heart of the French Quarter, where cobblestone streets wind between buildings adorned with iron lace balconies, there stood a mansion that commanded attention and admiration. The year was 1832, and New Orleans was a city of stark contrasts. Steamboats crowded the Mississippi River docks, their whistles echoing across waters that carried both commerce and human cargo. The air hung heavy with humidity, thick with the scent of magnolias and the less pleasant odors of a city where open sewers ran alongside streets of impossible beauty. 1440 Royal Street rose 3 stories above its neighbors, a monument to wealth and refined taste. The mansion's facade gleamed white in the relentless Louisiana sun, its Greek Revival columns supporting balconies where wrought iron railings twisted into intricate patterns of flowering vines. Behind those gates, gardens flourished with imported roses, their perfume attempting to mask the underlying rot of a society built on bondage. The woman who commissioned this architectural masterpiece was Madame Delphine Lalaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarty into one of New Orleans' oldest and most prominent Creole families. Her lineage was impeccable, her connections vast, her reputation beyond reproach. She had been widowed twice before marrying her third husband, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicolas Lalaurie, a physician of considerable reputation. Together, they hosted gatherings that set the standard for New Orleans society. On any given evening, carriages lined Royal Street, depositing guests in silk gowns and tailored suits. They ascended the mansion's front steps into a world of crystal chandeliers imported from France, mahogany furniture crafted by the finest artisans, and walls adorned with paintings worth small fortunes. Madame Lalaurie glided through these gatherings with practiced grace, her French flawless, her laugh musical, her compliments distributed with surgical precision to maintain her position at the apex of social hierarchy. But the enslaved people who served at these gatherings told a different story in whispered conversations in the slave quarters of other households. They spoke of the terror in the eyes of those who served at the Lalaurie mansion. They noted how staff seemed to disappear without explanation, replaced by new faces that bore the haunted look of people who had seen something that shattered their understanding of human cruelty. The neighbors began to notice as well. Monsieur Montreuil, who lived in the adjacent property, observed that enslaved individuals would arrive at the Lalaurie residence but were never seen leaving. When he inquired during a chance meeting on the street, Madame Lalaurie offered a practiced explanation. She was sending them to work her other properties in the countryside, she claimed, where their labor was needed for the harvest season. Her smile never wavered, her tone never faltered. She possessed the supreme confidence of someone who knew that her word would be accepted without question. In 1833, New Orleans, the law required that enslaved people be adequately fed, clothed, and not subjected to excessive punishment. But these laws existed primarily on paper, enforced only when violations became so public that authorities had no choice but to act. For women of Madame Lalaurie's social standing, the law was less a constraint than a minor inconvenience, easily navigated with the right connections and the right story. The mansion's kitchen staff worked under conditions that would have shocked even the most callous observers, had they been permitted to see. Meals were prepared in a sweltering basement kitchen where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. The cook, An elderly woman whose name would later become known only as testament to her final act of desperate courage was chained to the massive iron stove. The stated reason was to prevent theft of food. The actual reason was to ensure she could never escape to tell what she witnessed. As 1833 turned to 1834, the whispers grew louder. But whispers in the French Quarter rarely translated to action, especially when they concerned someone as well connected as Delphine Lalaurie. The machinery of society was designed to protect its own, and she was very much one of their own. The night was oppressively hot, even by New Orleans standards. The kind of heat that made sleep impossible, that drove residents to their balconies in search of any breath of air that might provide relief. It was on such a night that Monsieur Montreuil heard sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The screaming began just after midnight, not the usual sounds of discipline that occasionally emanated from households where enslaved people lived and worked, but something different, something that spoke of terror beyond comprehension. Montreuil rose from his bed and stepped onto his balcony, straining to identify the source of the commotion. What he witnessed would force the first crack in Madame Lalaurie's carefully constructed facade. On the roof of the mansion, illuminated by the full moon, a young girl ran. She could not have been more than 8 years old, her thin frame moving with the desperate speed of prey fleeing a predator. Behind her, moving with methodical determination, came Madame Lalaurie herself, still dressed in her nightgown, a cowhide whip gripped firmly in her hand. The child reached the edge of the roof. For a moment, she stood silhouetted against the night sky, her chest heaving, her small body trembling. She looked back at the woman pursuing her, then at the 3-story drop to the courtyard below. In that impossible choice between certain torture and possible death, the child chose to jump. The sound of her body hitting the courtyard's brick pavement carried clearly in the still night air. Montreuil stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. By the time he thought to call for help, he saw Madame Lalaurie descending to the courtyard, checking the child's broken body with the detachment of someone examining damaged property rather than a human life. What happened next revealed the true nature of the system that protected people like Delphine Lalaurie. Montreuil reported what he had seen to the authorities. An investigation was opened. Officials visited the mansion and questioned Madame Lalaurie, who expressed profound sorrow at the tragic accident. The girl had been mentally unstable, she explained, prone to fits of hysteria. She had escaped to the roof during one such episode and fallen. A terrible tragedy, certainly, but hardly the fault of a mistress who had shown nothing but Christian kindness to her household. The investigators might have been more skeptical had they been willing to question the other enslaved people in the household. But their testimony was not sought, and even if it had been, Louisiana law prohibited enslaved people from testifying against white people in court. The system had been designed with precisely such protections in mind. Nevertheless, public pressure demanded some response. Madame Lalaurie was fined $300 and ordered to sell 9 of her enslaved people. It was a slap on the wrist, a symbolic gesture meant to satisfy public outcry without actually holding her accountable. But even this minor penalty was easily circumvented. She arranged for family members and close associates to purchase the 9 individuals at public auction, and within weeks they were quietly returned to her possession. The legal system had spoken, and its message was clear. Delphine Lalaurie was untouchable. The whispers in the French Quarter grew more urgent, more desperate. The enslaved community knew the truth. They knew that the Lalaurie mansion was a place of unimaginable horror, that those who entered its doors often never emerged, and that those who did bore scars both visible and invisible that testified to torments beyond description. But in 1834, New Orleans, knowing the truth and being able to do anything about it, were two entirely different things. The machinery of power ground on, protecting those it was designed to protect, crushing those it was designed to crush. And behind the elegant facade of 1440 Royal Street, the horrors continued, unseen and unpunished. What do you think about what we've uncovered so far? How could an entire community know what was happening, yet do nothing to stop it? The answer to that question reveals uncomfortable truths about how systems of power operate then and now. April 10th, 1834, began as an ordinary day in the French Quarter. Merchants opened their shops, vendors hawked their goods in the French market, and the wealthy prepared for another evening of social engagements. At the Lalaurie mansion, preparations were underway for yet another lavish dinner party. The silver was being polished, the linens pressed, the menu finalized. In the basement kitchen, the elderly cook, chained to her stove, had reached a decision. Her name, never officially recorded, has been lost to history, but her final act of courage would change everything. For months, perhaps years, she had been witness to horrors that broke her spirit, but could not entirely extinguish her humanity. She had seen people dragged up the stairs to the attic, heard their screams echo through the walls, watched as bodies were removed under cover of darkness. She knew that escape was impossible. The chain that bound her to the stove was heavy and secure, the locks beyond her ability to pick. Even if she could free herself, where would she go? A 70-year-old enslaved woman had no safe haven in New Orleans, no protection under law, no recourse against the woman who owned her. But she could do one thing. She could ensure that the secrets of this house would not remain hidden forever. The fire started small, deliberately set in a pile of grease-soaked rags near the cooking fire. It spread quickly in a kitchen filled with wood, cloth, and cooking oils. Within minutes, smoke began pouring through the mansion's lower floors. Within an hour, flames were visible from the street. The alarm was raised. In a city built primarily of wood, where fires could destroy entire blocks within hours, the response was immediate. Neighbors rushed to form bucket brigades. The volunteer fire company arrived with their hand-pumped engines, and as was customary, citizens poured into the mansion to help rescue valuables and fight the flames from inside. Madame Lalaurie met them at the door, her composure remarkable for someone whose home was burning. She directed the firefighters and volunteers with specific instructions. Certain rooms needed immediate attention, other areas should be left alone. She was particularly insistent that no one enter the attic quarters, claiming they were empty and that efforts should be focused elsewhere. But Jean-Louis Montreuil, a judge and neighbor who had heard the rumors for years, was among those who responded to the fire. He had never forgotten what he witnessed the night the young girl died on the roof. And when Madame Lalaurie specifically insisted that the attic remain off-limits, his suspicions crystallized into certainty. He gathered several other men and headed for the stairs leading to the third floor. Madame Lalaurie attempted to physically block their path, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking to reveal the desperation beneath. When they pushed past her, she screamed for her husband to stop them, threatening legal action, invoking the sanctity of private property. The men ignored her and climbed to the attic. The door was locked from the outside, secured with a heavy padlock. They broke it open with an axe. The smell hit them first, an overwhelming stench of human waste, rotting flesh, and something else, something chemical and wrong. Then they saw what lay beyond. Thank you so much for staying with us through this difficult journey. I know this is not easy to hear, but it is crucial that we bear witness to this history. What comes next is the heart of this story, the moment when the full horror was finally revealed. The worst, and yet in some ways the most important part, is still ahead. The attic of the Lalaurie mansion was not a single room, but a series of chambers, each one a testament to systematic, prolonged torture. 7 people were found alive, though that word barely describes their condition. They were chained to the walls in positions that defied understanding. Their bodies bore evidence of medical experiments that suggested Madame Lalaurie had been using her husband's medical knowledge to explore the limits of human suffering. One woman had been confined in a space so small she could neither stand nor lie down, her body contorted into a permanent crouch. Her limbs had been broken and reset at grotesque angles, forcing her into a shape that resembled no natural human form. Another victim had their mouth sewn shut, unable to speak or scream, fed only through a small opening that had been deliberately maintained. The level of planning, the systematic nature of the torture, spoke to something far beyond spontaneous cruelty. A man had been subjected to what appeared to be surgical experiments. Holes had been drilled into his skull at various points, and a primitive form of lobotomy had been attempted. His eyes stared without seeing, his mind shattered by the violations inflicted upon his body. Another woman bore the evidence of skin removal, performed in a careful circular pattern that suggested this was not punishment, but experimentation, a horrifying perversion of medical science. The firefighters and volunteers who witnessed this scene were hardened men, accustomed to the brutal realities of life in 1834 New Orleans. Yet several vomited at the sight, others wept openly. One man later testified that in all his years, including service in military campaigns, he had never witnessed anything approaching the calculated cruelty evident in that attic. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was evidence of how long this had been occurring. The attic contained implements of torture that showed significant wear, suggesting years of use. There were chains of varying sizes, suggesting victims of different ages and builds. Most horrifying of all, there were indications that the 7 found alive were not the only ones who had occupied these chambers. The exact number of victims would never be known. News of the discovery spread through New Orleans with the speed and fury of the fire still burning in the mansion's lower floors. Within hours, a crowd had gathered outside 1440 Royal Street. Within a day, that crowd had swelled to thousands. The mood was volatile, dangerous. People demanded justice, demanded answers, demanded that Delphine Lalaurie be held accountable for her crimes. But Madame Lalaurie and her husband had already fled. While the crowd was still gathering, while attention was focused on rescuing the victims from the attic, the Lalauries had slipped out a side entrance, climbed into their carriage, and raced toward the outskirts of the city. By the time anyone thought to detain them, they were gone. They traveled first to Mobile, Alabama, where they had family connections. From there, the trail grows murky. Some accounts claim they eventually sailed to France, where Madame Lalaurie lived out her days in comfortable exile, never facing consequences for her actions. Other sources suggest she returned to New Orleans years later, living quietly under an assumed name in a cottage on the city's outskirts, dying peacefully in her bed. What is not murky, what is documented fact, is that no arrest warrant was ever issued, no extradition was ever attempted, no trial was ever held, no official criminal charges were ever filed. The legal system that had protected Delphine Lalaurie throughout her life continued to protect her even after her crimes became undeniable public knowledge. The mob, denied legal justice, turned their rage on the mansion itself. They broke through the gates, smashed the windows, looted the elegant furnishings that had so recently been the envy of New Orleans society. They took everything that could be carried, from silverware to paintings to the very light fixtures. It was destruction born of fury and frustration, a violent catharsis in the absence of actual justice. But even this rage eventually subsided. The mansion was repaired and sold. The new owner made no mention of what had occurred there, and buyers who came afterward seemed willing to forget. Within a year, the attic had been renovated, the evidence of torture removed, the blood scrubbed from the walls. The physical traces of the horror were erased with remarkable efficiency. More disturbing still was the social erasure that followed. The newspapers that had initially reported the attic's horrors with appropriate shock gradually stopped mentioning Madame Lalaurie's name. Society families who had attended her parties conveniently forgot they had ever known her. The city's elite, embarrassed by one of their own, chose collective amnesia over accountability. And the victims? Their names were never officially recorded, not in police reports, not in newspaper accounts, not in any official documentation. They existed in the historical record only as numbers: 7 found alive, an unknown number who died before discovery. They were denied even the basic dignity of being remembered as individuals, with names and stories and families who mourned them. This erasure was not accidental. It was a deliberate choice made by people who found it more convenient to forget than to confront the implications of what had occurred, because to fully reckon with the Lalaurie mansion meant reckoning with the system that made it possible. It meant acknowledging that slavery created conditions where such horrors could occur with impunity. It meant admitting that the laws designed to protect enslaved people were worthless when those in power chose not to enforce them. The survivors of the attic, those 7 who were found alive, disappear from the historical record almost immediately. There is no documentation of medical treatment they received, no record of what became of them, no acknowledgement of their suffering beyond the initial shock of discovery. They became invisible, just as they had been invisible when they suffered. Walk down Royal Street today, and you will find the mansion still standing at 1440. The facade has been restored to something approaching its original grandeur. The columns gleam white. The wrought-iron balconies have been repaired and repainted. The shutters hang straight and true. Tourists photograph it daily, often unaware of the history contained within those walls. Over the decades since 1834, the building has served many purposes. It became a school for girls, where young women studied literature and deportment, blissfully ignorant of what had occurred in the attic above their classrooms. It housed a conservatory of music, where the sounds of pianos and violins replaced the screams that once echoed through the halls. It was divided into apartments, then converted into luxury condominiums worth millions of dollars. Each renovation brought new discoveries. During one reconstruction in the early 20th century, workers found shackles embedded in the attic walls, rust-stained and heavy. During another renovation in the 1970s, human bones were discovered beneath the floorboards, their presence never officially explained. Each time, there was a moment of acknowledgement, a brief reminder of the building's history, and then life continued. The question of numbers haunts historians who study the Lalaurie mansion. 7 were found alive. But how many died before that April day in 1834? Some estimates, based on the wear patterns of the torture implements and the testimonies of neighbors about disappearances, suggest dozens. Others believe the number could be higher still, pointing to the unexplained skeletal remains found over the years. But the question that should haunt us more is not about Madame Lalaurie's individual cruelty, monstrous though it was. The question is about the system that enabled her. How many dinner guests heard screams emanating from the upper floors and chose to ignore them? How many neighbors saw the terror in the eyes of her household staff and said nothing? How many officials accepted her explanations, her bribes, her social standing as sufficient reason to look the other way? The answer is dozens at minimum, perhaps hundreds. An entire community knew that something terrible was happening at 1440 Royal Street. An entire legal system had multiple opportunities to intervene. An entire society made a collective choice to prioritize the comfort and status of one wealthy white woman over the lives and suffering of enslaved human beings. And after the truth was revealed, that same society made another choice: to forget, to erase, to move on without reckoning, without accountability, without justice. Madame Delphine Lalaurie died without ever answering for her crimes. Her victims died without ever being acknowledged as individuals deserving of remembrance. The system that enabled her faced no consequences, no reforms, no meaningful examination. This is not ancient history. The Lalaurie Mansion stands today as it stood then, a monument to how easily horror can be hidden behind elegant facades. It reminds us that evil does not require monsters acting alone in the shadows. Evil requires a society willing to look away, institutions willing to protect the powerful, and laws that exist on paper but disappear when it comes time to apply them to people of privilege. The most disturbing aspect of the Lalaurie story is not that it happened. The most disturbing aspect is how easily it was nearly lost to history. If not for a fire set by a desperate woman who chose death over complicity, the attic's secrets might never have been revealed. If not for a few men who insisted on investigating, despite Madame Lalaurie's protests, the evidence might have been destroyed. This horror was discovered by accident, not by design. Which leads to the question that should keep us awake at night. If this horror was only revealed by chance, how many others remained hidden? How many other plantation mansions contained similar chambers of torture? How many other wealthy enslavers used their position and power to inflict suffering that went undocumented and unpunished? The historical record offers disturbing hints, references in letters and diaries to enslaved people who disappeared, testimonies from people who escaped slavery, describing tortures that seemed impossible to believe, archaeological discoveries at plantation sites revealing evidence of violence far beyond what official histories acknowledged. The Lalaurie Mansion may have been extraordinary in the extremity of its horrors, but it was not unique in the basic fact of its existence. The mansion stands today in a city that has become a tourist destination, where people come to experience the romance of the Old South, the charm of the French Quarter, the excitement of Bourbon Street. Most walk past 1440 Royal Street without knowing its history. Those who do know often treat it as a curiosity, a ghost story, a titillating tale of historical horror disconnected from present concerns. But the lessons of the Lalaurie Mansion are not historical curiosities. They are urgent warnings about how systems of power operate, how privilege shields perpetrators, how societies choose collective amnesia over difficult reckonings. The same patterns that protected Delphine Lalaurie continue to operate today in different forms but with similar effects. The powerful still evade accountability, the vulnerable still suffer without recourse, the systems still prioritize stability and order over justice and truth. The story of the Lalaurie Mansion forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how systems of power protect those within them, even when their crimes are unforgivable. Madame Delphine Lalaurie was never punished, never faced trial, and never answered for the torture and deaths she inflicted. Her victims were never named, never honored, never given justice. This is not just history. This is a pattern that repeats whenever we prioritize protecting institutions over protecting the vulnerable. What do you think should be done with places like this? Should they be preserved as reminders of our darkest chapters, or does their continued existence re-traumatize descendants of those who suffered? How do we honor the victims whose names were never recorded, whose suffering was deliberately erased from official memory? And perhaps most importantly, what does it say about us if we allow these stories to be forgotten, if we choose the comfort of ignorance over the discomfort of truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story impacted you, please subscribe to our channel and help us continue bringing hidden histories to light. And stay tuned. Our next recommended video explores another suppressed chapter of American history that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.